Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to talk about austerity measures and just austerity in general because it's a big issue that comes up in debate all the time when you start talking about government policies as well as fiscal management. So I'm going to walk you a definition of what it is. I'll walk you how it's being used. I'll walk you through some of the issues, and I'll talk about a little bit about what needs to go forward in terms of government finances. Now, this is only one perspective on fiscal management cycle, including austerity measures by government. Now, it's not deemed to be the only one. You're more than apt to go out and listen to what other economists do, but you need to be very careful when you start listening to them. The left will give you their perspective that austerity doesn't work. The right will tell you it's required. You need to come to the balance, which is into the middle, to kind of look at all policies. What's required is part of moving the taxation systems and expending of government forward as part of making ensuring it's sustainable. A little brief bio about myself. I've got about 25 years experience. I've spent a lot of time in academia, more on the public policy side and finance. I taught some courses in this area, so I'm going to give you my perspective of looking at various government financial statements from whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal. I'll talk about what austerity is. I'll give you an example of Ireland. I'll talk about Canada as well. And I'll talk about issues with austerity as well as what can be done. Now, austerity measures in a nutshell are basically bringing in measures to get control of the debt and deficits. And really that means is government's cutting spending. It's looking at ways to raise revenue. In other words, it's imposing measures to better get control of its debt to bring it down. And that's really what we're talking about, because if governments don't take drastic actions, their bonds can become to junk bond status, or they can become insolvent. And that's really what this is about, is governments can control their finances. Now, why do governments hesitate, and why do people talk about that it doesn't work? Well, whenever you impose austerity measures, you're taking money out of the economy. When you take money out of the economy, you actually hurt it in general. You can actually prolong recessions because you're taking the money out. Second point comes into play, if you do not have a strong private sector. In most cases, the private sector is driven by retail sales or consumer spending. If it's not investing, the private sector can't absorb the cuts from government, and that's the other thing that basically can lead to issues in terms of the overall management of austerity measures and make things worse. And that's the thing that comes into play when you talk about economists, whether they're left or right belief, is because of that. I'm giving you in a nutshell here. That's the reason why a lot of governments are hesitant to bring in full austerity measures. Now, like anything else, there's been success. Ireland's a good example because they were a basket case. Their banks didn't have the capitalization. They were in a deep recession, so there were few issues. So the government of Ireland got a bailout from the European banks to bail themselves out. They paid back a lot of those loans as part of the austerity measures. They did deep government cuts, so they reformed their government to focus on exports. That's led to significant growth. So if you look at the far right hand side, since 2014 they've showed growth. You're going to ask yourself, why am I showing Japan? Well, Japan, based on an economist named Paul Krugman, basically said that Ireland should impose what Japan did. Well, Japan's measures have not worked. They haven't stabilized the economy. If you look at it, they've had periods of recessions where you see 2 successive quarters, and they've seen slower growth than basically Ireland. So what Ireland's basically saying is, we went our own direction and map, and we've solidified or made our economy stronger compared to Japan, who's struggling. And even with Japan's sake, Japan's debt to GDP is about 120%. So that, bear in mind, needs people to understand, is you need to put things in perspective. Every government responds differently by its measures. What Ireland chose to do seems to have worked for them. I need to talk a bit about Canada as well, as Canada imposed austerity measures in the 90s because we had a high debt to GDP ratio. And what they did is, we had a strong economy, so the private sector was able to pick up a lot of the burden. So what the government did is they cut the transfers. These are the equalization amounts that go in to support healthcare and education. They reduced government spending anywhere from 4 to 5%. Then what they did is all governments do. They revisit their liabilities by going through actuarial work to make a determination whether these liabilities are fully funded. They took some of that benefit in as part of deficit fighting. Here's the issue that comes into play here. First of all, when you start making cuts to transfers to healthcare, that puts a lot of pressure on local, provincial, or state governments. And that's what Canada did here. It forced them to either cut hospitals or consolidate to make tough decisions to deliver that quality care. Or they had to raise taxes. The second point is, when you make deep cuts, you're delaying payments to a future period with the belief that you'll have an improvement in the terms of revenue and stabilization of your expenses. That's on the predicated on the fact that you're able to keep your fiscal cycle managed. That's something that isn't discussed as well. In the case of Stephen Harper, when he came into power in 2006-2007 reign, he bumped up the transfers back to the government. Now, there was already agreement in, but he kept that deal in place to ensure that the health care was properly funded from a federal level. Now, that doesn't deal with anything at the point of time where the provinces don't deliver things in an efficient and effective way. But what it is they provide better money to flow through the transfers. He also made sure all social programs are properly funded. So where that delay happened in the 90s, it was pushed off to future generations. That's something you need to bear in mind. Are there risks to austerity measures in the world? Yes, there are. Because most governments are struggling with high deficits and high debt to GDP ratio. At some point, you're going to be forced to do things because your bonds themselves are based on your credit rating. And if Moody's and Standard & Poor's go out and start assessing the financial strength of your area, you could see impact on your bonds being devalued. And if the bond rating gets devalued, that means higher interest costs. The higher interest costs of your debt means less money for other programs like education, social, healthcare, and different programs. So that's something to bear in mind. We also see in slow economic growth of 3.1% or low at an aggregate level. So if you're not seeing strong economic growth, you're not going to see strong initiatives in terms of the revenue side being growing. So it's incumbent on government to basically get control of its house. And that's basically what you need to come into play. Second thing is, we have too many governments that are either going too far left or too far right with policies. If we bring in any sort of new policy when you have an economy that's not growing by leaps and bounds, it actually can hurt it. And you're seeing that with cap and trade, because most governments think they want to put in these climate change policies that are probably too far left. Do we need to do something climate change? Yes. But are we to go too far left? Probably not. Are we supposed to go too far right? No. But the issue is once you impose carbon tax or sort of price for carbon, that gets passed along to the consumers from the start of the supply chains to the end. It'll add another 8 to 10% to the cost of goods sold. That means that takes money out of the economy these people spend because they're paying for higher price goods. We also have an issue with consumption taxes. A lot of areas too, the governments themselves are hiking consumption taxes. That impacts consumer spending, and it actually can prolong recessions or slow spending down. We also are looking at government policies that are trying to subsidize wind, solar, smart grid. Part of that rationale is they want to promote green, clean technology. The problem is if those projects are not profitable on their own right, all you're doing is masking it. And at some point, assessment will be made whether those businesses are viable or whether those grants the government can afford them. Government likes to pick and choose winners. Some of that is political pressure from the lobbying. Choosing winners in a business got a failed model isn't a recipe for success. So you have to question that. Very few governments are really emphasizing value for money. That's looking at internal value for money audits and looking at the cost of delivery. In the private sector, we look at cost of goods sold all the time. We look at cost to serve models because we're constantly revisiting them, how we read that cost out. Government doesn't work in a competitive environment, so there's no pressure to reduce costs other than their fiscal management cycle is deemed to kind of look at those areas. There's no grass and consumption tax collection. In the U.S. case, in a lot of countries, they have a provincial sales tax. Most countries need to move to a consumption tax. That makes it you're grabbing tax on a bigger basket of goods and services, and that actually allows you to better manage the overall tax policies and the tax approach. It's something to watch and play as governments move forward in terms of maximizing revenue. Now, what can governments do to control debt without going fully embracing austerity measures, what they can do is move away from provincial sales tax, so in other words just taxing goods like retail goods, to more into a consumption tax and taxing everything. So it allows you more opportunity on the revenue side. They can revisit their taxation programs like excise and duty to bring down the cost of goods of consumer goods, to look at better ways to kind of promote that. They can freeze or hold the line to Social Security increases to the cost of inflation. They can look at basically maximizing returns, so take in those pension funds and make sure that independent boards are oversighting to maximize the returns. EI returns, again, is another fund that typically is separate, but it should be probably independent so that you can maximize return of that investment, as well as looking at how it's being utilized to better support job creation or extending benefits to those areas, so you have to manage that program. On the cost side, they really need to emphasize cost of delivery. They really need to impose activity-based costing model, and then they have to look at the whole cost of doing things. They have to look at the arbitration settlement process. Does it make sense, and is it aligning to the private sector? They probably need to look at the grid itself, where people reside on that grid, and align it better to the public sector, the private sector, in terms of its salary payout. Because in Canada's case, we can see anywhere from 6 to 8%. The public sector is paid more than the private sector. That's not sustainable, and that needs to be corrected. Pension reform. They need to move away from defined benefit, guaranteed benefits, to defined contribution plans to better maximize return and overall risk. They should institute value for money in all departments and agencies, and so when there's audits that come out, they should be mandated to make improvements. Selling off assets. Now there's a question there with that. What they should be doing is, some of these assets they have no business running. The private sector probably can do it. What they should be doing is see if they can maximize those value, whether it's an IPO or whether the private sector should take that over. That's some of the work they should be doing as part of a gap action item. They should be reducing the size of government through automation, collapsing the departments to become more efficient. The private sector's always said the size of government's getting too big and it becomes too unwilling with red tape, different aspects, more red taping, regulations, and all that filing. You want to put the emphasis where companies are expanding their business and growing it, with that emphasis. So we need to find the right balance when we're starting to look at regulation, whether they're environmental assessments, taxation code issues. We need to get the proper reforms in to kind of make sure we do that. And that's why basically I've looked at different aspects of all the approach, because if we don't take a look at the big picture, austerity measures are a dangerous game to play unless you have a right balanced approach to how you do it. And the reason why I want to do this presentation is to show you how austerity can work, to show you the risk to it. Now, my intent was with this presentation is to get you to go ask questions back to your MLA, your MP, your the Prime Minister, local politicians, whether they're congressmen, senators, whether they're governors, whether they're presidents. You can go back and ask people, because at the end of the day, you want to see your program sustainable, but you also want to see job creation, so you have an opportunity to advance your career. The idea with austerity measures is we have to watch them to make sure they make sense, that at the end of the day that government's sustainable. Thank you.